Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Cynthia Bloom.
And I'm Scott McCandless. This is our last episode of 2025, and as we edge towards December 31st, we wanted to take a moment, or maybe more than a moment, to reflect on significant developments from this year and what their possible impact might be in 2026.
We asked members of our tax policy team and others to weigh in on everything from OB3 to Pillar 2 to trade to the economy. Here are their comments.
When thinking about major tax policy developments in 2025 that will affect 2026 and beyond, it's hard to ignore OB3, the signature piece of legislation from House and Senate Republicans and the Trump administration. Really dealt with the vast majority of issues that needed attention over the next couple of years. And I think one of the collateral effects of that will be not a lot of tax policy being made in 2026, at least not from a legislative perspective. Of course, there will be a ton of guidance that continues to come out over the next several years, and that'll be the more immediate tail on that. But given the partisan nature of the legislation, as is often the case when you have unified control of government, I'm not expecting a ton of new legislation in 2026, just guidance projects that will continue throughout, for which taxpayers need to pay attention. But I think substantial new legislation is likely reasonably remote, given how much was tackled in OB3.
A bit more political than policy. The 2025 off-cycle elections in Virginia, New Jersey, New York City, the results of those elections convinced both parties that affordability really was the winning message. And that messaging is something we'll hear throughout the midterm year and will probably guide a lot of congressional decisions on where tax policy should focus going forward. And I'm not just talking about the premium tax credit debate we're having now and we'll likely be talking about in 2026. The legislation that's developed within the affordability messaging could have a lot of staying power. And since many affordability measures cost money, all this stage setting around affordability could also implicate congressional thinking about raising revenue through the tax code in the longer term.
We've seen the challenges enacting tax policy during the consideration of the One Big Beautiful Bill, with narrow majorities in the House and Senate. It requires getting virtually unanimous consent on every single issue. One development to watch for in 2026 is whether the pace of retirements in Congress continues, especially with regard to the Republican majority. But also look out for what has become a recent trend, and that is the midterm resignation. Narrow majorities in the Congress and the potential for midterm resignations could make the prospect of enacting additional tax policy even more difficult in 2026.
The economy in 2025 was marked by resilience of the American consumer in the face of several major disruptions. For the first time in generations, we saw very large increases in tariffs that affected the timing and level of trade flows. The labor market softened, and at the same time as reductions in immigration slowed the growth of the labor force. Inflation persisted above levels targeted by Federal Reserve policymakers. We also experienced the longest lapse in government funding in history. Whether the economy continues to show that resilience will shape the environment for tax policy in 2026. Tax reductions enacted in July 2025 are expected to result in tens of billions of dollars in additional tax refunds, providing some support to demand. Positive effects from individual rate reductions and business investment incentives are expected to dominate any negative effects on labor supply from reduced immigration. The release of delayed federal outlays after the 6-week government funding lapse is expected to provide a temporary boost to GDP. Whether any expected positive effects allay consumer concerns about affordability may factor into the possibility and scope of additional tax legislation in 2026.
So the big development in 2025 that I'm going to be watching as we head into 2026 is the Trump administration's emphasis on deregulation. So we know that we had a major reconciliation bill enacted in July, and that bill brings with it obviously a need for regulatory guidance. But at the same time, the administration signaled very early on a heavy emphasis on reducing the regulatory burden on taxpayers. So a big question as we head into 2026 is, what areas will the Trump administration prioritize for that deregulatory effort? And frankly, how much progress will they make over the course of the next 12 months?
If 2025 was about pressure testing the global tax system, 2026 is about living with results. On Pillar 2, 2025 marked the shift from theory to reality. Dozens of countries moved into live implementation, and the OECD's inclusive framework spent much of the year reducing friction, working toward a political agreement on a side-by-side approach that effectively exempts US-parented multinationals, along with additional safe harbors to address country-specific concerns, as well as modest simplifications. Although, none of that makes Pillar 2 simple, but it does shape how companies will manage compliance and risk in 2026, particularly in Europe. At the same time, 2025 confirmed that digital services taxes aren't going away. With Pillar 1 stalled, more countries leaned into DSTs and similar measures. The US administration responded by sharpening its playbook, signaling trade, tax, and diplomatic tools to counter what it sees as discriminatory measures. And that tension carries straight into 2026. Finally, tax multilateralism is evolving. The OECD remains central, but the UN's tax work gained momentum in 2025. In 2026, companies should expect a more fragmented, politically charged global tax landscape.
"2025 was a challenging year for the IRS. We saw the departure of many top leaders and approximately 25% of the workforce, with neither of the IRS's two political positions currently occupied. The day-to-day operations are being run by the Social Security Administration administer. Still, day-to-day work continues, including new examinations. And while there are challenges, we have seen many new opportunities for companies to resolve long-standing disputes. Moving into 2026, areas we are watching include the IRS's modernization efforts, the IRS's eventual enacted budget and what impact that might have on its operations, OB3 implementation, and then finally, resolution of IRS challenges in litigation and otherwise, specifically as it relates to economic substance and other technical positions being pursued more broadly.
While not specifically a tax issue, tariffs and trade were an enormous issue in 2025, are likely to remain significantly important going into 2026, and will probably stay in a prominent place on the radar for perhaps the next decade. That's partly because of the massive amounts of revenue that the tariffs have been generating. That is a type of revenue that Congress is keeping an eye on, that the executive branch is keeping an eye on, and we will continue to see a variety of trade tools deployed by the executive branch, some of which have a long history of being used, others where they're plowing some new ground and there might be some judicial scrutiny. But either way, this is likely to continue to be a major story. Now, to tie this back to tax, there is a significant development going on in almost every company and every client with whom we speak, and that is trying to create better communication flows between the tax professionals, especially in transfer pricing, and the trade professionals within those organizations. To the extent that can be improved, perhaps even made seamless, that is providing a significant advantage to those companies.
As we know from discussions with corporate tax leaders throughout the year and at our recent Global Tax Symposium, the run-up to OB3 really was the Super Bowl of tax. It drove months of intense engagement with repeated trips to Washington for meetings on Capitol Hill, at Treasury, and even the White House. And while the enactment of OB3 was a defining moment in 2025, the need for ongoing engagement with policymakers remains extremely high. Tax departments are still coming to DC because the focus has now shifted to Treasury and the IRS. Companies need regulatory guidance on the international tax changes in OB3, on the new cost recovery rules, and on how the transition provisions interact with each other, as well as with regimes like CAMT and BEAT. And at the same time, companies see a real opening for tax regulatory reform. There's an opportunity to move toward a more principles-based approach in areas that have become unmanageably complex. And globally, even with the Pillar 2 side-by-side agreement, it will not go into effect until individual countries legislate. That may necessitate ongoing engagement with U.S. policymakers to help reinforce this happening. For companies, 2025 wasn't an endpoint. It was an important milestone, and the next phase of implementation is already underway, and it will require continued, sustained engagement.
I've seen three developments coming out of the year that will influence the actions of tax leaders heading into 2026. The first area is rethinking and assessing operating models. The underlying companies itself are reassessing where they place people, where they place IP, and where they make investments to meet commercial developments. Our tax buyers have to make choices that are directly influencing the actions of their organizations so that they can incorporate the relevant tax considerations for these business changes and how rules like GILTI, FDII, Pillar 2, etc. interact. The second area is AI. It's becoming a part of everyday tax operations. Teams are assessing how to use AI in reporting, planning, and governance. And the decisions they make now and the relative speed with which they can move are driven by policies around transparency, incentives, and responsible adoption around these areas. And the final area is managing rising complexity with limited capacity. Leaders want to meet the growing regulatory demands, but they have to do so while maintaining quality. The push for efficiency, which will be supported by the AI point I discussed earlier, redefines what tax functions need and what they're able to execute against. Across all three of these areas, I believe tax is central to business strategy, and the choices that these tax leaders make will set the pace for the year ahead.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. In addition to resuming programming in the new year, we're also looking forward to the launch of PwC's 2026 Tax Policy Outlook. We will have further details on that and much more when we return.
On behalf of the Policy on Demand team in Washington and those around the country, we wish you a happy holiday season and new year. Take care.